In this episode of Models from Music Literature, we'll talk about Aarre Merikanto's orchestral poem, Notturno. Briefly, Aarre Merikanto was a Finnish composer born in 1893, and he lived till 1950. His early style was rooted in Finnish Romanticism, as practiced by his father, Aarre Merikanto, who was also a pretty well-known composer of the time. In the 1920s, he developed a more atonal personal style, also incorporating the orchestration techniques of the French Impressionists like Debussy and Ravel. The orchestral piece Notturno was written at the height of Merikanto's maturity as a composer. The piece showcases Merikanto's colorful orchestration as well as his use of polytonality, which permeated many of his pieces from this era. I've prepared an orchestral reduction, so I'll put a link to that PDF in the description so you can follow along. Merikanto describes the opening of Notturno as an orchestrated sunset. And to fully understand the orchestration of the piece, we must also discuss the harmony. The piece begins in a modal impressionist style. We are in C Aeolian, and Merikanto introduces a motif of B flat to G. This is supported by flutes and clarinets playing lush 7th and 9th chords. We are in 3/4, which imparts an almost lullaby type effect. It's also important to note that orchestration-wise, the piece begins with flutes and clarinets, a very warm sound. The bassoon is brought in on measure 2, giving us a hint of the darkness yet to come. In measure 3, the bass clarinet enters and starts its descent, at first diatonically, then growing more chromatic as the piece darkens. The catalyst for change happens in measure 4, where the flute plays an F sharp, the augmented 4th, which is outside of the key. The lower chord in the bass clarinet, bassoon, and clarinets is diatonic to the key of C minor. But the upper structures hint at D major or B minor. The oboe enters with a D, or sharp 11 of the A flat chord produced in the low winds. At this point in the piece, we have to analyze it bitonally and with a non-functioning harmony. In other words, the tonal ambiguity increases towards the end of this excerpt. We should also talk about the D in the violin. The grace note motif from E flat to D tries desperately to hold on to the key of C minor, but it finally gives way to an E natural in measure 7, ushering in the new key. This motif returns at the end of the piece, but here we are just focusing on the introduction. In measure 5, the English horn enters with a D on the treble staff. An interesting color choice, as it's above the instrument's tessitura. It's also important that it helps complete a B minor sonority with the flute. This is the key that was hinted at in the previous measure. So we now have a B minor in the flute and English horn over an A flat major chord in the bassoon and clarinets, with a G in the bass clarinet, which belongs to B minor. The dissonance has increased substantially in this measure. with the prevalence of sharp 9s and sharp 11s. The orchestration is also getting increasingly darker as the bass clarinet plummets. In measure 6, we start to experience the bitonal effect more fully. Although technically the inner voices are tonally ambiguous, the outer voices are in G Aeolian, harkening back to the introductory A Aeolian or that modal impressionist sound. The violins introduce an almost folk-like melody, which is a hallmark of Merikanto's late style. The bass clarinet and later the cello in measure 7 offer a counterpoint to the violin, but remain diatonic. However, the clarinets and bassoons in measure 7 through the beginning of measure 9 produce non-functioning dominant chords on A-flat, B-flat, A-flat, G-flat, and again A-flat. Over this we have the English horn, moving chromatically, to further increase the dissonance and tonal ambiguity. In measure 8, the violins harken back to the introductory motif by playing alternating stepwise chords. Only this time it's B major to A major, implying a Lydian or whole tone sound. The horns enter at measure 7, bringing a new orchestral color to the piece. The highest horn plays F sharp, D, and E, implying D major. So in a way we have two opposing whole tone scales against the G minor tonality in the outer voices. In measure 10, the bass plays a B natural below the cello, effectively undermining this G minor tonality. The bass will rejoin the cello briefly in measure 11, and this reinforcement brings a shift in the outer voices. In measure 12, the violin plays the fifth folk motif from earlier, but this time E flat is the root, and it's in a Lydian type scale that fully morphs into the whole tone sound by the end. In measure 12, the flutes return with a descending quarter note half note motif from the opening bars, but in parallel major sevenths this time. The motif returns again in 13 and 14 in the high winds, but this time in minor thirds, so it's much more consonant than the parallel major sevenths. Once again, the outer voices are aligned in this closing cadence, producing an E flat minor 7 to D flat minor 7. The inner voices produce an A minor 7 to G minor 7. We have a highly dissonant cadence, but it's important to note that rhythmically and thematically it's a return to the opening, almost as a memory of the setting sun in the tone painting of the piece. We have a wonderful high harmonic in the violins before the final flute motif. The violins also state the eighth note whole tone gesture of the horns in measure 11, but this time inverted. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment below and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll have more orchestration and analysis videos coming soon because I think it's really the best way to learn music, especially if it's a piece that you like. You know, it's great to get in there and see the inner workings of it. And even doing this now, I learned a lot about Merikanto and his style, and I think, you know, anytime you do this, really I really think it's the best way to learn as a composer is to study scores and to yeah, you know, if it's something that you really like, a passage, a cadence, whatever, you know, it's great to take it apart. Of course, you know, the theory comes after the music, but it's great to have these techniques and to yeah, just if you're interested, just to be able to uncover these secrets, you know. But yeah, we'll see you on the next one. Thanks again for watching.